The faint hum of the Stellar Tempest's engines was Rick Morrison's only company as the bulky freighter drifted through the vacuum of the Velikova Nebula. He leaned back in the pilot's chair, his boots propped up on the console, his eyes scanning the endless expanse of stars. It was supposed to be a quiet run. Just him, his cargo, and the open void. Rick liked it that way. No complications. No entanglements. But quiet never lasted long in the black. A shrill beep broke the stillness, the proximity alarm lighting up his console. He sat upright, frowning. Nothing was scheduled to be in this quadrant, and he sure as hell wasn't expecting company. Adjusting his scanner, he saw the source of the anomaly. A small, battered escape pod floating listlessly, its signal weak but unmistakable. Great, Rick muttered. His first instinct was to ignore it. He wasn't in the business of rescue, and whoever was in there probably had a story he didn't want to hear. But something about the pod's haphazard drift nagged at him. Cursing his curiosity, Rick flipped on the comms. "This is the freighter Stellar Tempest. Do you require assistance?" Silence answered. He checked the pod's vitals. Oxygen levels were critically low. Damn it. He keyed in the retrieval sequence, watching as mechanical arms reached out to secure the pod and pull it into his docking bay. He grabbed his pulse pistol from the console, just in case, and headed to meet his unexpected guest. The hatch hissed open, releasing a faint mist. Inside the pod, slumped over in the cramped confines, was a figure wrapped in a silvery survival suit. Rick's eyes narrowed. Definitely not human. The lithe build and faintly glowing violet skin were dead giveaways. He'd seen enough alien species in his years hauling freight to recognize she wasn't from any of the usual worlds. The figure stirred, blinking large, luminous eyes. She tried to stand but stumbled. Rick caught her, the touch of her skin sending a strange, warm tingle through his hands. "Whoa there, easy," he said, helping her out of the pod. "You all right?" Her voice was soft, melodic, but the words came out garbled, her translator struggling to keep up. After a few adjustments, it clicked into coherence. "Thank you for saving me." Rick raised an eyebrow. "You've got about 30 seconds to tell me who you are and why I shouldn't shove you right back into that pod." "My name is Esra," she said, her gaze earnest and wide. "I'm being hunted. Please, you must help me." Rick wasn't sure why he agreed to let her stay. Maybe it was the desperation in her voice, or maybe he was just a sucker for trouble. Esra explained her situation over a hastily prepared meal in the Tempest's galley. She was a member of the Elleries, a reclusive species known for their psychic abilities. Her people had strict laws against venturing beyond their home system, but Esra had broken them to escape an arranged marriage to a powerful crime lord. "He's sent hunters after me," she said, her hands trembling. "If they catch me, I'm as good as dead." Rick sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, lady, I'm just a hauler. I'm not looking to get involved in whatever mess you're dragging with you." Her eyes met his, shimmering with an intensity that made him pause. "You already are." The proximity alarm blared again. Rick rushed to the cockpit, Esra close behind. On the scanner, 3 sleek vessels appeared, closing in fast. "Let me guess," Rick said grimly. "Your friends?" Esra nodded. "We have to run." Rick's hands flew across the console, pushing the Stellar Tempest to its limits. The freighter wasn't built for speed, but Rick had made enough illegal modifications over the years to give them a fighting chance. The hunters opened fire, and the Tempest shuddered as its shields absorbed the brunt of the blasts. "Hold on," Rick shouted, yanking the controls into a steep dive. The ship careened through a dense asteroid field, dodging rocks and laser fire alike. The hunters followed, relentless. Esra gripped the back of his chair. "There's a jump point nearby. If we can reach it, we can escape." Rick glanced at the NAV system. The coordinates she provided were risky, but they had no other choice. "I hope you know what you're doing," he muttered, punching in the sequence. The Tempest lurched as it entered the jump, the stars outside the viewport stretching into streaks of light. Rick let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. They were safe, for now. Hours later, the freighter drifted in the relative calm of uncharted space. Rick stood at the viewport, watching the distant glow of a nebula. Esra joined him, her presence quiet but palpable. "Thank you," she said softly. "You didn't have to help me." "Yeah, well," Rick said, scratching the back of his neck, "don't make a habit of it." She smiled, a faint, otherworldly thing. "There's one more thing." Rick groaned. "Of course there is. In my culture," she began, her voice hesitant, "to seek protection is to claim a bond. A mate bond. It's the only way I can invoke sanctuary under interstellar law." Rick blinked, turning to face her fully. "Wait a minute. Are you saying?" Ezra's cheeks flushed a deeper violet. "To ensure my safety, I must declare you as my mate. Legally, it binds us." Rick stared at her, his mind racing. He had 1,000 reasons to refuse. This wasn't his problem, and the implications of such a claim were staggering. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within him. "Well," he said finally, "this just got a hell of a lot more complicated." Rick couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his bunk, staring at the flickering light above him, Ezra's words looping in his mind. "I must declare you as my mate." What the hell did that even mean? He wasn't some naive spacer. He knew alien cultures could be complicated. But this? Sanctuary laws, mate bonds, and crime lords weren't exactly on the list of things he signed up for when he bought the Stellar Tempest. Yet here he was, with a fugitive alien girl in his ship, and her problems were now his problems. Groaning, he rolled out of bed and headed for the galley. Maybe a strong cup of synthetic coffee would clear his head. Ezra was already there, sitting cross-legged at the small table, a steaming cup in her hands. Her violet skin glowed faintly in the dim light, her expression distant. She glanced up as Rick entered, offering a tentative smile. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. Rick grunted, pouring himself a cup. He leaned against the counter, studying her. "You want to tell me why you didn't mention this mate bond thing before I risked my neck for you?" Ezra's gaze dropped to her cup. "I didn't think we'd get this far," she admitted. "Most people wouldn't have helped me at all. I didn't want to scare you off before you understood." "Scare me off?" Rick snorted. "Lady, I've smuggled contraband through Seoul's quarantine zones and outflown bounty hunters. But tying myself to someone under interstellar law? That's a whole new level of crazy." She flinched, and guilt pricked at him. He sighed, setting his cup down. "Look," he said, softening his tone, "I get that you're desperate, but this bond thing, is there another way? Something less permanent?" Ezra hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. "The bond is ceremonial, but it's also a declaration. If I invoke it, no one, not even the Syndicate, can harm me without violating a Larisai law. The bond protects both of us, Rick." "Protects me?" he asked, skeptical. She nodded. "If the Syndicate kills you, the bond transfers to the next of kin, creating a chain of retaliation. It's complicated, but it's one of the few laws even criminals fear to break." Rick rubbed his temples. "Complicated doesn't even begin to cover it." Ezra stood, stepping closer. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm asking for your trust, Rick. I know it's a lot, but if you help me, I'll do everything I can to make this right." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the ship filling the space between them. Finally, Rick exhaled. "Fine," he said, his voice gruff. "We'll play it your way. But you owe me, Ezra. Big time." Her relief was palpable. "Thank you," she said, her smile returning. Rick drained the rest of his coffee in one gulp. "Yeah, don't thank me yet." 2 days later, trouble arrived in the form of a sleek, predatory starship that caught up with them just outside the Galaris Drift. Rick had barely registered the warning beacons when the comms crackled to life. "Freighter Stellar Tempest," a cold, mechanical voice said. "This is Captain Zal of the Eviscerator. Surrender the fugitive, and you will not be harmed." Rick glanced at Ezra, who had gone pale. "Friend of yours?" She shook her head. "He's one of the Syndicate's best hunters. If he's here, they've escalated the search." "Great," Rick muttered. "Let me handle this." He hit the comms button. "Captain Zal, this is Rick Morrison. I'm afraid you've got the wrong ship. No fugitives here, just hauling cargo to New Tarkis." A pause. Then Zal's voice returned, colder than before. We know she's aboard. You have 1 minute to comply before we open fire. Rick killed the comms. All right, he said, gripping the controls. Buckle up. Things are about to get interesting. The eviscerator fired first, its plasma cannons lighting up the void. Rick threw the Tempest into a steep dive, the freighter groaning under the strain. Alarms blared as the shields absorbed a glancing blow. Can't you jump us out of here? Ezra shouted, clutching the co-pilot's seat. Not until the drive cycles. Rick barked back. We're sitting ducks for another 2 minutes. Another volley slammed into the shields, sending sparks flying across the cockpit. Rick gritted his teeth, his hands dancing over the controls. The Tempest wasn't built for combat, but Rick knew his ship like the back of his hand. He pushed it to its limits, weaving through the asteroid field that loomed ahead. The eviscerator followed, its sleek frame cutting through the debris with surgical precision. Rick cursed under his breath. Whoever Zal was, he wasn't just a thug with a gun. He was a damn good pilot. Ezra suddenly gasped, her hands glowing faintly. Turn left. Now. Rick didn't question her. He yanked the controls, narrowly avoiding an asteroid that exploded behind them as Zal's cannons fired. He glanced at Ezra, who was trembling but focused. How did you? Later, she shouted. Right, hard right. Rick obeyed, dodging another volley. The Tempest slipped through a narrow crevice, and for a moment, the eviscerator fell behind. The drive's ready, Rick called out. He slammed the jump controls, and the stars outside the viewport blurred as the ship catapulted into hyperspace. When the Tempest emerged from the jump, Rick collapsed back in his chair, sweat dripping from his brow. Ezra sat beside him, her breathing heavy. Nice flying, she said softly. Nice directions, he replied, eyeing her. You're full of surprises, aren't you? Ezra hesitated, her glowing eyes avoiding his. There's more you need to know. About me. About why they're after me. Rick raised an eyebrow. More? Lady, you're already the most complicated hitchhiker I've ever picked up. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I wasn't just running from a marriage, she said. I stole something from the syndicate. Something they'll do anything to get back. Rick groaned, slumping forward. Of course you did. Rick stared at her, his patience wearing thin. All right, Ezra, out with it. What exactly did you steal? And don't sugarcoat it. I need the full picture if I'm going to keep us alive. Ezra took a deep breath, her glowing violet skin dimming slightly, as if the weight of her confession dulled her natural luminescence. It's a data core, she began, her voice tight. Not just any core. It contains a fragment of my people's Singularity Codex. Rick frowned. Singularity Codex? Sounds important. She nodded, her expression serious. It's more than important. It's sacred. The Codex is the sum total of our civilization's psychic history. Every thought, every memory, every discovery my people have made since we first awakened our abilities. The Syndicate acquired a piece of it through less than honorable means. If they unlock it, they'll have access to technology and psychic techniques that could destabilize entire systems. Rick leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. So let me get this straight. You stole a holy relic from a ruthless crime syndicate, and now they want it. And you, back at any cost? Ezra winced. Yes. Fantastic, Rick muttered, rubbing his temples. You know, I could have ignored that damn escape pod. Could have floated right past it, gone on with my nice, simple life. But no, I had to play hero. I'm sorry, Ezra said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to drag you into this. Rick sighed, waving a hand. Too late for that now. What's done is done. But if I'm going to help you, I need to know everything. Where's the data core? Ezra hesitated, then reached into the folds of her tunic. From a hidden pocket, she produced a small, shimmering sphere about the size of a marble. It pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light, intricate patterns swirling across its surface. This, she said, holding it out to him. Rick stared at the sphere, feeling a strange pull, as though it was alive. He resisted the urge to touch it. And you've just been carrying it around this whole time? What if they'd caught you before I showed up? I'd planned to destroy it if it came to that, she said, clutching the sphere protectively. But as long as there's a chance to return it to my people, I can't give up on it. Rick paced the cockpit, his mind racing. All right, here's the deal. We can't keep running forever. If we want to get the syndicate off our tails, we need to put this thing somewhere they can't reach it. Ezra's eyes widened. You mean, destroy it? No, Rick said quickly, shaking his head. I'm not about to start messing with something that looks like it might explode into psychic fireworks. But we can stash it somewhere safe, someplace the syndicate wouldn't think to look. Ezra frowned, her glowing eyes narrowing. Where? Rick smirked, a mischievous glint in his eye. Ever heard of the Veil Cluster? Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. You can't be serious. The Veil Cluster is a graveyard. No sane pilot would go there. Exactly, Rick said, which makes it the perfect hiding spot. The radiation storms and gravitational anomalies make it nearly impossible to navigate. No one in their right mind would follow us in there. Ezra's hesitation was clear, but she finally nodded. All right, if you think it's our best shot, I trust you. Rick clapped his hands together. Great. Strap in. It's going to be a rough ride. The Veil Cluster loomed ahead like a swirling maelstrom of chaos, a mass of churning gas clouds illuminated by the erratic pulses of dying stars. Rick's heart pounded as he guided the stellar tempest toward the edge of the cluster, the ship's sensors screaming warnings about the hazardous conditions. This is insane, Ezra muttered, gripping the co-pilot's chair. Welcome to my life, Rick replied, his focus razor-sharp. The tempest shuddered as they entered the cluster, the ship's shields straining against waves of radiation. Rick's hands flew across the controls, compensating for gravitational surges and dodging debris. The deeper they went, the worse the conditions became. Almost there, Rick said through gritted teeth. There's an old mining outpost in the center of the cluster, abandoned years ago. If we can make it, we'll be safe, relatively speaking. Relatively? Ezra echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief. Compared to the alternative, Rick shot back. I'll take it. The mining outpost loomed ahead, its jagged structure silhouetted against the chaotic backdrop of the cluster. Rick brought the Tempest in for a landing, the ship's landing gear groaning as it settled onto the creaking platform. Home sweet home, Rick said, powering down the engines. Ezra didn't look reassured. You're sure no one knows about this place? Positive, Rick said, grabbing his pulse pistol from the console. No one's been here in decades. The radiation storms make sure of that. They stepped out into the stale, metallic air of the outpost. The structure was eerily silent, its corridors littered with debris and long-abandoned equipment. Rick led the way to a central storage vault, his steps echoing in the emptiness. This'll do, he said, nodding at the reinforced chamber. We can leave the core here and lock it down. Even if someone finds the outpost, they won't be able to get through without the access codes. As Ezra carefully placed the data core into the vault, Rick's comms crackled to life. A cold, mechanical voice filled the air. Freighter Stellar Tempest, this is Captain Zoll. Did you really think you could lose us in the Veil Cluster? Rick's blood ran cold. He and Ezra exchanged a glance, the realization hitting them at the same time. They followed us, she whispered, fear etched into her features. Rick's jaw tightened as he reached for his comms. Zoll, you're either brave or crazy to come into this cluster. You want the core? Come and get it. The voice on the other end chuckled, dark and menacing. Oh, we intend to. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the outpost corridors. Rick yanked Ezra behind a stack of rusting cargo crates as the first set of heavy footfalls echoed closer. The outpost, already eerily silent, now pulsed with the sharp clang of approaching boots and the faint hum of high-energy weapons. The Eviscerator's crew had landed. How the hell did they track us? Rick hissed, gripping his pulse pistol tightly. Ezra's glowing eyes darted around their hiding spot. It must have been the core. It emits a faint psychic resonance. If they had a skilled tracker, they could follow it, even through the radiation storms. Rick groaned. Of course it does. All right, new plan. Survive long enough to regret all my life choices. Stay close to me. Ezra nodded, her expression grim. The first mercenary rounded the corner, clad in black armor, his helmet's visor glowing a menacing red. Rick didn't hesitate. He fired, the pulse blast striking the mercenary square in the chest. The man crumpled with a grunt, but his fall alerted the others. A sharp burst of plasma fire zipped past Rick's head, scorching the crate behind him. He ducked, dragging Ezra down with him as the air filled with the deafening cracks of gunfire. "They're flanking us," Ezra shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Rick peeked around the corner, counting 3 more mercenaries advancing on their position. He pulled a grenade from his belt, primed it, and lobbed it toward the nearest group. The explosion rocked the corridor, sending debris flying and momentarily silencing the gunfire. "Move," Rick barked, pulling Ezra to her feet. They sprinted down the corridor, weaving through the labyrinthine structure of the outpost. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, the mercenaries relentless. As they reached a dead end, a sealed bulkhead with no visible control panel, Rick cursed under his breath. He spun around, raising his pistol, ready to make a last stand. But before he could fire, Ezra stepped forward. Her hands glowed brighter than ever, and an unearthly hum filled the air. The mercenaries skidded to a halt, their weapons raised. But before they could fire, a wave of shimmering energy erupted from Ezra's hands, crashing into them like a tidal wave. The mercenaries were thrown back, their weapons clattering to the ground. Some writhed in pain, clutching their heads, while others lay motionless. Rick stared at her, his mouth agape. What the hell was that? Ezra's glowing hands dimmed, and she swayed, her breathing labored. A psychic pulse. It disables their minds temporarily. But I can't do it again. Not without rest. "Remind me never to piss you off," Rick muttered, stepping over the unconscious mercenaries and retrieving one of their weapons. "Let's keep moving." As they reached the central control room, the comms crackled again. Zal's voice was smooth and chilling, every word dripping with confidence. "Impressive, Ezra. I see you've been holding back. I must admit, I underestimated you." Rick scowled, scanning the control panel for anything he could use to lock down the outpost or escape. "Zal, if you're so impressed, why don't you come down here and tell her yourself?" A low chuckle resonated through the comms. "Patience, Morrison. You'll see me soon enough. But first, I suggest you surrender. You can't win this. Not against me." Rick glanced at Ezra, who shook her head vehemently. "Ignore him," she said. "He's trying to rattle us." "Yeah, well, it's working," Rick muttered. "But I'm not giving him the satisfaction." Suddenly, the outpost shuddered, the lights flickering. Rick looked up, alarmed. What the hell was that? Ezra's face paled. "He's trying to destabilize the reactor. If it goes critical, we're toast," Rick finished, slamming his fist against the console. "Great. Just great." Rick worked furiously at the controls, bypassing ancient security systems and activating every available defense mechanism. Automated turrets whirred to life, and blast doors sealed behind them. The mercenaries wouldn't have an easy time reaching the core now. "That should slow them down," Rick said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it's only a matter of time before Zal figures out how to bypass everything. We need an exit strategy." Ezra stared at the swirling data on the console, her brow furrowed. "If we can't take the core with us, we have to destroy it." Rick turned to her, stunned. "Destroy it? Didn't you just say it's sacred to your people?" "It is," she said, her voice trembling. "But if the Syndicate unlocks it, countless lives will be at risk. I can't let that happen." Rick hesitated, then nodded grimly. "All right, how do we do it?" Ezra placed her hand on the console, her glowing skin interfacing with the ancient system. Data streams lit up the room as she worked, searching for the facility's failsafe protocols. Finally, she found it, a self-destruct sequence tied to the vault's integrity. "If we activate this," she said, "the core will be obliterated. But we'll only have minutes to escape." Rick glanced at the monitor, then at Ezra. "No pressure, huh?" Before Ezra could initiate the sequence, the bulkhead behind them exploded. Rick shielded his face from the blast, coughing as smoke filled the room. When it cleared, Captain Zal stood in the doorway, his imposing frame silhouetted by the flickering lights. Zal was tall and lean, his cybernetic enhancements gleaming in the dim light. His eyes glowed a piercing red, and his voice was a smooth, menacing rumble. End of the line. Rick raised his stolen weapon, but Zal moved faster than any human could, disarming him with a single swipe. Rick staggered back, clutching his wrist. "You've been a thorn in my side, Morrison," Zal said, his gaze shifting to Ezra. "And you've caused me no end of trouble. Hand over the core, and I might let you live." Ezra stepped forward, her glowing hands trembling but steady. "You'll never have it, Zal." Zal chuckled. "Brave, but foolish." As he lunged toward her, Rick tackled him, throwing all his weight into the cybernetic hunter. They crashed to the floor, grappling as Ezra frantically worked at the console. "Rick, I need time," she shouted. "Take all you want." Rick grunted, narrowly dodging a blade that extended from Zal's arm. "I've got him right where I want him." Zal flung Rick across the room like a rag doll, turning his attention back to Ezra. But before he could reach her, Rick grabbed a nearby wrench and hurled it with all his strength. It struck Zal's cybernetic eye, sending a shower of sparks across the room. Ezra's voice rang out. "It's done." The alarms blared as the self-destruct sequence activated. Zal's expression twisted with rage. "You fools. You'll die with it." Rick hauled himself to his feet, grabbing Ezra's hand. "Not if we beat you to the exit. Let's go." Rick and Ezra sprinted through the corridors of the crumbling outpost, the deafening wail of the self-destruct alarm driving them forward. The walls trembled with each detonation, chunks of metal and debris raining down around them. Behind them, Captain Zal's distorted, mechanical voice echoed, still determined to capture his prize. "You can't run forever," Zal bellowed. The sound of his boots pounding against the floor grew closer. Rick glanced back, gritting his teeth. "Damn, this guy doesn't quit." Ezra's glow had dimmed even further, her exhaustion apparent. "We're almost there. The ship is just ahead." They rounded the final corner, the stellar tempest loading ramp extended and waiting. Rick ushered Ezra up first, firing a few desperate shots behind him to keep Zal at bay. The hunter dodged effortlessly, his cybernetic enhancements giving him a deadly precision. "Go. Start the engines," Rick yelled, slamming the ramp's control panel as he scrambled aboard. The ramp began to retract just as Zal lunged forward, his metal fingers clawing for a grip. Rick fired one last shot. This time, it found its mark. Zal's hand sparked violently, and he fell back, disappearing into the chaos of the imploding outpost. Rick collapsed into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over the controls. "Hang on, Ezra. This is gonna be close." The tempest roared to life, its thrusters burning bright as it lifted off. Rick pushed the engines to their limit, the ship shaking as it blasted out of the outpost just as the final explosion consumed it. Behind them, the structure imploded in a dazzling cascade of light, the shockwave rattling the tempest as it sped away. Silence fell in the cockpit, broken only by the steady hum of the engines. Rick slumped back in his seat, exhaling deeply. "Well," he said, "that was officially the stupidest thing I've ever done." Ezra managed a weak smile, sinking into the co-pilot's chair. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved me and the Codex." Rick glanced at her, his expression softening. "Yeah, well, I've got a bad habit of sticking my neck out for trouble." Ezra tilted her head, her glowing eyes locking with his. "You didn't have to do any of this, but you did." "Why?" Rick shrugged, looking away. "I don't know. Maybe I just couldn't stand the idea of someone like Zal winning. Or maybe—" He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Maybe I figured you were worth the risk." Ezra's cheeks flushed a faint violet. "I don't know how to repay you, Rick. Just promise me no more secrets," Rick said, leaning back. "If you're carrying any more psychic artifacts or have more crime lords after you, now's the time to spill." She laughed softly, the sound like a melody. "I promise. No more secrets." The stellar tempest drifted into a quiet stretch of space, its crew recovering from the ordeal. Rick set the ship on autopilot, leaning back with a sigh. "So," he said, "what now?" You've got no home to go back to, no safe haven. What's your plan, Ezra? She looked out at the stars, her expression thoughtful. I want to rebuild. To find others like me, those who've been scattered across the galaxy. My people's knowledge can't die with me. The Codex fragment was just the beginning. Rick raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a hell of a mission. It is, she said, turning to him. And I can't do it alone. Rick smirked. You asking me to sign up for another round of insanity? She smiled back, her eyes shimmering. Maybe, but you've already proven you're pretty good at it. Rick chuckled, shaking his head. Guess I've got nothing better to do. Besides, someone's got to keep you out of trouble. Ezra extended her hand. Partners. Rick took it, his grip firm. Partners. Far away, in the blackened ruins of the mining outpost, a shadow stirred. The debris shifted, and a battered figure emerged, sparks flickering from exposed cybernetics. Zal's one remaining eye glowed red, his mechanical hand clenching into a fist. This isn't over, he growled, his voice a low, menacing rasp. Not by a long shot. Somewhere in the stars, the hunter was already planning his next move. And aboard the Stellar Tempest, Rick and Ezra set course for an uncertain, thrilling future. Partners against the galaxy's dangers, and perhaps something more.